Thank you for tuning in. My name is Brendan. I'm going to be hosting this webinar. This is the final event in a series as part of the Forest City Tree Festival that was held at Western University this fall. The Forest City Tree Festival is sponsored by the Western Sustainable Impact Fund and the City of London, working with a number of community partners, including some that we have represented on the call today. We're joined by Cathy Quinlan from the Upper Thames River Conservation Authority and Maddy Sansom, who's from the City of London Urban Forestry team. Welcome to you both. This webinar is being recorded. We're going to be sharing a lot of interesting information about the health of London's urban forest, the Watershed Report Cards, maybe some challenges and opportunities for planting trees in our city, celebrating the roles that trees play in our lives, and the relationships between trees and a healthy environment. I'm honored to introduce our speakers this evening. I'll start with Maddy Sansom. Maddy is a forestry inspector in the Urban Forestry Department at the City of London. Her work is primarily focused on forest health, including surveying for beech leaf disease within city woodlands and participating in early detection programs for oak wilt, Asian longhorn beetle, and spotted lanternfly. Maddy also administers the Tree Canopy Conservation Program, whereby homeowners can access funding to conduct maintenance on their trees, incentivizing the retention of large diameter trees within the city. In her spare time, she enjoys gardening, knitting, and spending time with her many animals. Welcome, Maddy. And it's a pleasure to introduce Cathy Quinlan, who has worked as a terrestrial biologist with the Upper Thames River Conservation Authority for 26 years. She works on a variety of programs related to natural heritage, forest health, and land restoration. Welcome, Cathy.
Thank you.
For listeners who aren't familiar, we're going to be referencing the Watershed Report Cards, which are published every few years by the Upper Thames River Conservation Authority. Cathy's going to walk us through a presentation talking about some of the aspects of those report cards that relate to trees and forestry. So I'm just going to share my screen and hand it over to you, Cathy.
Great. Just wait for that to come up. Right, thanks very much for the invitation to join you today. So I'm just going to go through some slides that summarize the 2022 Upper Thames River Watershed Report Cards. Next slide, please. So what is a Watershed Report Card? It's a report on environmental information that we release every 5 years, and we've been doing it since 2001. It's a little 8-page report card for each of 28 sub-watersheds across the Upper Thames River watershed. So you'll see on the map on the right-hand side, we've broken down the watershed into 28 smaller watersheds. They could either be tributaries like the Medway or the Avon River, or sections of the main branches of the Thames River. We break it down to a smaller geographical area so we can track changes more readily and help hopefully motivate community action, because people identify more with the watershed, the smaller watershed they live in versus the entirety of the Thames River. And in these report cards, we provide grades for surface water quality and forest conditions, and I'll be reviewing those right now. Next slide. So as I said, we give letter grades to surface water quality and forest conditions. And for each of these, we have 3 indicators that we use to provide these grades. And the grades are your typical A through F, and you'll see on the right-hand side, F from excellent to very poor. And the indicators we use relate to the land use, how we're using the land, as an indicator of the environmental quality. All the things we do are part of what the Upper Thames monitors. We monitor water quality on a continual basis, and we map forest cover on a continual basis. So these are things we have available to us. And they're also a measure of an environmental measure of the effectiveness of programs that we're offering to protect water quality and preserve our natural areas. We use a province-wide grading system. So generally there's higher grades in areas of the province with less development and lower intensive land use, as you might expect. So don't expect any A grades here in the Southwest is what I'm warning you about. Next slide. So just very briefly for surface water quality, we look at total phosphorus, and phosphorus is an element that you find in fertilizers and detergents as well as waste, and it contributes to excess algae growth and low oxygen in our rivers. We also measure E. coli bacteria, and these are fecal coliform bacteria that are found in the guts of animals, including humans. And they are a strong indicator for the presence of other disease-causing organisms in the water. And finally, benthic macroinvertebrates, and these are the aquatic bugs that live in the stream sediments. And they're an excellent indicator of water quality and stream health because they live there all the time and they have to put up with whatever the water quality is flowing over them. Next slide. So here are the results. We pull all those three indicators together and each have an equal weight, and we come up with a grade. And the map on the right shows two different colors. The green color is our C grades, and the D grades are shown in that lighter orange color. And there's actually an even distribution, 14 Cs and 14 Ds across the watershed. But what we're finding is it takes a really big change to change a grade. So what we try to do is look at the individual indicators and that data and say, is it getting a little better, a little worse, or about the same? And what we're finding is 5 of those little watersheds had actually improved a bit over the last 5 years since we did this in 2017. That was our last watershed report card. Most of them, 21, remained steady, and 2 had seen some declines. And overall, those indicators scored a D for phosphorus, a C for bacteria, and a D for the benthic invertebrates. So overall, the Upper Thames scores a D grade for water quality. Closer to London, some examples, the Medway Creek scored a C grade with some improvement. And the Forks right downtown, that watershed scored a D, and it was steady. So all this information is available. Next slide. So people ask, why do we have these grades? Well, there's many factors that combine to influence water quality. We have seen some long-term improvements, and when you look back at the 50s and 60s, water quality was poorer. But since municipalities have stepped up and improved their sewage treatment systems, and citizens and farmers have made some changes, we're actually seeing better water quality than we did, say, 50, 60 years ago. But things haven't improved a lot recently. Other things that we're finding is that major storm events deliver the highest amount of pollutants. And we are seeing more of these extreme weather events than we did in the past. So those big storms are pulling pollutants off the land and bringing them into the river. What we're also finding is areas where we've got good streamside vegetation, good forest cover along the streams, that does help to improve water quality because it creates the natural conditions that the organisms and the biomechanics can reduce the pollution in the river. Next slide. Now onto the forest conditions. So for our assessment of forest conditions, we have 3 indicators. The first is percent forest cover. So it's simply the percent of a watershed that is forested or wooded. And I'm using those 2 words interchangeably, forest and wood. Environment Canada has a report out that it's called How Much Habitat is Enough, and it indicates that we need at least 30% forest cover at a watershed level to sustain our species and to maintain decent watershed health. The next indicator is percent forest interior, and that's the percent of the watershed that is forest interior. And that is the protected core area 100 meters inside a woodlot. So if you have a woodlot that's only 200 meters wide, it doesn't have any interior. It has to be larger than that. And they found that a lot of bird species require these larger habitats to nest successfully. If they nest too close to the edge of a forest, there's more predators, there's more wind throw, there's more risk to survival. And Environment Canada recommends we have at least 10% of this type of forest in a watershed. And finally, percent riparian zone forested. And this is the amount of forest cover within 30 meters of all the open water courses and creeks and rivers. We know that forests along rivers support extra high numbers of species, and it also functions to protect the water quality. And Environment Canada also suggests we need at least 50% forest, 50% of our riparian zone in a forested condition. Next slide. So what did we find? And just to make a step back, that this is based on 2015 aerial photography. So every 5 years, the planes fly over the watershed and take photography. But by the time we receive the information and process it, there's a lag time. So we are using slightly older photography. So the grades that we have are the greenish colored watersheds are your C grades. We had 5 of those. 22 Ds, that's the majority of the watershed. And 1 sub-watershed at the top end of the watershed near Mitchell received the only F grade. Again, it takes a lot of change to move, to change a grade. But if we look at some individual trends, we could see that 10 of those sub-watersheds showed a slight improvement. 13 were steady and 5 showed some decline. Our indicators, so overall, the percent forest cover across the Upper Thames is only 11.3%, and that's a D grade. Remember I said earlier, 30% was sort of the standard we're trying to reach, even though we will never reach that in this part of southwestern Ontario. We have 1.5% forest interior, which is very low, so that's an F grade overall. And about 35% of our riparian zone is forested, so that's a bit better. A C grade. So overall, a D grade for forest conditions, just as for surface water quality. Next slide. So just zoning in on some local results. I pulled up a few local subwatersheds to London: Pottersburg Creek in the East End, Medway Creek near the university, and the Forks downtown. So you can scan over and see that percent forest cover. All those watersheds received D grades, and they're actually lower than the Upper Thames average. Percent forest interior also very low, lower than the Upper Thames average. And the riparian zone forested, a bit mixed bag, actually. The Medway Creek had the lowest amount, whereas the Forks had the highest amount, even though it had the lowest, some of the lowest forest cover. And each of those showed, Pottersburg and Medway showed some slight declines, and the Forks showed a slight improvement. And I'll talk about that in the next slide. Okay, so gain and loss. When we compare our grades between the last report cards in 2010, or the information from 2010 compared to 2015, we did find 781 hectares more of woodland across the watershed. And you might be shocked to find that out. Like, how do we get more woodland? Well, this is due to forest succession from thickets and young plantations. There was a lot of tree planting in the 1970s and 80s, and those trees are now reaching maturity. And so we can now move them out of the young tree category into the mature forest or woodland category. So these didn't pop out of the ground in the last 5 years, but they've been slowly aging to the point where we can now call them forest cover. But unfortunately, tree planting rates have slowed over time, and we're unlikely to see this kind of jump in gain in the future. And of course, we still have loss. We lost 353 hectares of woodland between 2010 and 2015. And that was land that was converted to urban or rural land uses. And it's not one huge woodland. It's a little here, a little there, edges of woodlands coming off. And it's especially noticeable in urbanizing watersheds like around London and Woodstock, for example. You might ask, is that a lot or is that a little compared to what we've seen in the past? So our previous losses are, we lost 227 hectares in the last 5-year period, 2006 to 2010, and 471 in the 5 years before that. So you'll see we still have work to do to maintain our forest cover. And the illustrations on the right show a woodland at the top there, where there has been some tree planting between some 2 mature woodlands. And you can see those trees are now big enough that they're called forest cover. And the 2 pictures on the bottom right show a little woodland along a creek that existed in 2010, and the bottom picture shows that it's been removed by 2015. So these are the little incremental losses we continue to see. Closer to home in the Medway watershed gained 16 hectares, but lost 40. So a net loss there. And in the Forest watershed, there was a gain of 24 hectares, but also a loss of 15. So you see how challenging it is to actually document forest cover changes because it's a very dynamic system. Next slide. Another thing the Watershed Report Cards do, is, we do provide this information on the grades. We also provide a great deal of information on some characteristics about the watershed or the features. So we supply information, say, on population change over the last 5 years. So this watershed has seen 54,000 more people in the watershed, a 10% increase between the last two censuses. So we know there's a lot more human pressure on our landscape. In the Forks watershed, there was an 8% population increase. In the Medway, 19%. So you can see what parts of the city are growing with this information. We also report things like wetland cover. There's about 5.2% wetland cover overall across the watershed, which would have its own grade of a D, for example. But we do have some A grades out in the Komoka area. That little watershed has 13% forest cover, which would be an A. And in the Dorchester area where the Dorchester Swamp is, 12%. So we do have some nice tracts of wetland, but overall it's quite low. And we also have some information on watercourses. For example, there's 6,000 kilometers of watercourse in the watershed, and only 30% of that is in a natural state. The rest has been either straightened or channelized or buried. So this kind of information helps describe or explain why we're getting the grades that we're getting. Next slide. And we also include information about Great Lakes connections because what happens upstream affects downstream. So the map on the top right shows the Thames River watershed, with London being kind of upper middle there. And it takes about 4 to 10 days for the water from the upper part of the watershed to flow downstream past the First Nation reserves, past Chatham, out to Lake St. Clair. So the water quality in our watershed affects Lake St. Clair and ultimately Lake Erie. The Upper Thames River Conservation Authority and many other partners have developed this shared waters approach. And it's basically an updated Thames River watershed management plan. And we've had involvement with consideration from First Nations, federal, provincial governments, municipalities, two conservation authorities. We're trying to work together to get the Thames River healthier than it is today. And we've got some implementation underway. Next slide. The report cards also list several actions for improvement. What can be done about these grades, and what can we all do to help improve our grades? So we list a bunch of actions. So for example, the use of low impact development techniques such as rain gardens to reduce our stormwater runoff. We recommend establishing cover crops in agricultural fields to reduce runoff and soil erosion over the winter and early spring months. And we also encourage the continuation of tree planting along our streams to connect the riverside woodlands that already exist and create a more continuous corridor of tree cover. Next slide. And the report cards also on their last page include some highlights of progress since the last report card. So we look to the community and the work that's being done and try to record some pat on the shoulder programs. So for example, under land protection and restoration, there are tree power programs that's actually started in London and now are offered in Stratford, St. Mary's, and Perth South, where citizens are offered a native tree for the low price of $20. And this has been highly successful. Other groups like the Friends of the Medway have helped plant over 7,300 trees and shrubs at 12 sites through the Upper Thames Communities for Nature program. And we also applaud the work of municipalities that are improving our sewer and infrastructure projects because while it's not sexy and it is expensive, it's very important. It's a very good way of improving water quality in our river by ensuring that runoff from our cities and our sewer systems does not enter the river. Next slide. And just some highlights. The Upper Thames has a long-standing tree planting program, and between 2016 and 2020, we planted over 235,000 trees on 146 hectares at 500 sites. So landowners wishing for some more trees on their property, we're there to help. We also have programs that involve students and community members, and over 19,000 people participated in tree planting programs over these 5-year period. And the map on the right shows the density of trees planted. So in some parts of the watershed, quite a few trees were planted and others not so many. So we're constantly trying to market to every part of the watershed to get those trees planted. Next slide. And so ultimately, the report cards here their aim is to turn information into action, giving people the information to help them make good decisions. We want to create awareness about local watershed conditions for folks. We host workshops for landowners to tell them about stewardship programs. We provide a lot of funding to assist with tree planting, erosion control projects, that kind of thing. And we also promote best management practices, especially around agriculture, cover crops and constructed wetlands and those kind of things to support our healthier watershed. Next slide. So one last thing is in 2016, the Upper Thames developed environmental targets. And our targets were to increase each sub-watershed's water quality score by 1 grade by 2037. And establish and restore 1,500 hectares of natural vegetation, windbreaks, buffers, also by 2037. Those are large targets, but if you don't set a target, we find it's hard to know where you're going. And we're hoping that these report cards are an information resource for planning and education for both our staff, for municipalities, agencies, the public, partners, researchers, anybody can make use of this information. Next slide. So all this information is on our website, and we've included this. We have a new feature this year called an interactive map, where you can click on various sub-watersheds and see what the water quality grades are, the forest conditions grade is, and compare them across the watershed. Next slide. And we also have a story map on our website. So again, you can click on a watershed and see some photos of that watershed and photos of people doing various projects on the land and a little description about that watershed. So again, trying to get people tied in with their local environment. So all the report cards are on the website and they're available for download. So please look it up when you have a chance. Next slide. That might be it. Yes, so that's it. So yeah, again, you can explore all the watershed report cards at thamesriver.on.ca. So I'll wrap it up there.
Accidentally muted myself.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Cathy. That was some really great information. The watershed report cards are fascinating to read. That is a resource I would highly recommend to students in particular that are maybe thinking about avenues for research projects or ways to get involved in benefiting the environment. A lot of people that I know are really concerned about biodiversity loss and climate change and wonder, how can I help? What is something that I can do that's tangible? And I think the watershed report cards are a wonderful roadmap to lead people towards stewardship opportunities. So to carry out this panel, we came up with some questions for panelists based on conversations had in the community. Some of these questions are related to things that Cathy addressed in her presentation. Some of them are more broad and looking at the relationships we have with trees and forests in our city per the theme of the festival. So I'm going to go through some of these questions in the order I see them, but feel free to chime in anything you want to add. And you're welcome to sort of jump in, either of you, if you want to answer the question. So a question I have wondered about is London is often called the Forest City. Um, this is the Forest City Tree Festival. Do either of you know where that moniker came from? And in your opinion, do you think that calling us the Forest City still suits us?
Cathy, or yeah, I guess I can I can speak to it. Cathy, if you have anything to add, then for sure go ahead. But from my understanding, London is called the Forest City. There's a couple of sort of uh, stories around why we're called the Forest City. The first being is that we really were a city within a forest. So the forest was here first, and the city sort of popped up out of the forest, and there were large trees all around. And it really was, yeah, it really was a city in a forest. And because of the abundance of large diameter trees in the area, a lot of the local infrastructure and homes were actually constructed out of timber from the surrounding landscape. And so that aspect of it as well still applies, and kind of fed into more of the idea that we really are a city created from the forest as well. So um, that's sort of my understanding. I don't know if Cathy, if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I've also heard a couple different stories, and I don't know exactly which one's right. Yeah, I heard also one that said when the Lieutenant Governor Simcoe passed through here in the 1700s, he envisioned London as the capital of Upper Canada. Of course, there was nothing, not there was a lot of things here, but it was just forest, right? So it was going to be this city where the forest was, as you say. And the other story I've heard is that, as the land all across southwestern Ontario was cleared for agriculture and settlement. As the city grew, it started to plant trees for its forests and around homes and along the river. So it became a more treed area than the surrounding agricultural land. So it became kind of, from the air you'd look down, you'd see a lot of trees. So they thought it was like a forest city. So again, I don't know which one of those is actually it, but everybody's city needs a moniker. So
Yeah,
Yeah,
those are.
as far as, sorry, Brendan, go ahead.
Oh no, absolutely. Chime in, Maddie.
Yeah, as far as, does it suit us today still? I think that, I mean, absolutely. Like we have such a high density of parks and green spaces in the city, and still, like, always amazes me. I'm not from London originally, I'm from the GTA, and Toronto has a lot of parks, but I was always like blown away with how many parks and how big the parks were in London. And I think that, that impact is still there when you come now with the development expanding into the surrounding areas, and you don't see that quite as much. There's a lot more clearing happening. And I think too, I have heard comments like, oh, well, London's the forest city. Like, don't we have enough trees already? Like, if we're called the forest city, why are we planting trees? Why do we need more trees if this is our name, So that they're granted, and sort of taking that, yeah, that title for granted, and acting like we don't need to do more to conserve and improve the urban forests. So just wanted to add that to it.
Yeah, I appreciate that perspective. I'm also from the Greater Toronto area, and although there were certainly trees where I lived, I did not have access to a canopy like I enjoy living in London. What strikes me about the name Forest City is that it's also not just, it's like a literal wedding of the forest and the people. And what stands out to me about London is the Londoners care so much about the trees. Like we did a tour earlier today at the Grosvenor Lodge, and we visited a silver maple that was planted 100 years ago. And we heard a story about how students used to get a quarter for every tree that they planted, and a lot of those trees are still standing today. You can go back to the origins of our city, and people cared about trees and still do. So I think the moniker fits personally. Um, for my next question, I wanted to actually share something, a visual reference. So I once went down a rabbit hole and I wanted to find like what is the oldest map of where we live. And I came across this survey from 1795 of the River La Tranche or the Thames from its entrance or confluence with Lake St. Clair up to the Upper Forks. This was printed in 1795, and you can see the proposed site of the city of New London shown there in that little red square. Um, that's to remind us that, of course, people have lived here much longer than the proposed city of New London. Archaeological evidence suggests people lived in the region over 12,000 years ago. What I'm wondering about, maybe you can provide a little bit further detail. What were the forest conditions like here if you were to go back to, I don't know, 1795? Like, what kinds of compositions of trees would we see? Obviously there was a lot more forest, but was it just like a blanket sheet of trees, or did we have other wetlands, other types of cover mixed in between?
Yeah,
I know you've
I
run
can
around
start
back
off,
then.
and then I can start off, and Maddy can add in. Certainly, it would have been a mostly forested a landscape around here. In the uplands, probably the climax forest is Maple Beach, so probably was a substantial amount of that. In the river valleys, various components of more wet tolerant trees. But also because the First Nations people came and went and used these territories for hundreds and hundreds of years, they might have had some clearings where settlements were and crops were grown. So it wasn't a continuous cover. It would have been interrupted by little openings like that, as well as wetter areas and drier areas. But yeah, that'd be my understanding.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely like a much more dense canopy than we see today,
Yeah.
which isn't hard to do, but lots of large trees as well. So a lot more large diameter veteran trees. So dense canopy cover in those forested areas would have been less ground cover. You wouldn't see as much, herbaceous vegetation with that dense canopy in the shade. Certainly, yeah, the permanent settlements, the Haudenosaunee longhouses in the area, they would have been a more stationary people. They would have moved to hunt and fish, throughout the seasons, but their homesteads and their houses were definitely more permanent structures on the landscape. So you would have had, as Cathy said, those sort of small pockets of clearings, and then paths that they would have followed along primarily waterways. So the clearing of large areas within a forest wasn't really something that would have happened. They would have followed the natural, landscape features that would have made transportation more a bit easier. I do also have sort of a little anecdote about sort of like the species that would have been here as well. So chestnut, more white pine as well, which would have been definitely attractive to early settlers as they would send the timber back to England to build ships' masts and things of that nature. So unfortunately we don't see that as much on the landscape naturally nowadays, because as with many areas in Ontario, you would have had that high grading of the large trees being removed from the landscape. And of course, white pine was such a desirable species at the time as well. So also sort of fun anecdote is sassafras was commonly used and still is used to construct dip nets, which were used for fishing, specifically for pickerel, because it's such a lightweight wood with a really straight growth habit. So those trees would have been used then and still used now by the indigenous communities. And so, yeah, that's sort of what I understand. In speaking with members of the indigenous communities of their sort of understanding of what the area would have been, like, and yeah, so.
Sassafras is such a cool tree. I mean, just its leaf shape and the smell of it is really unique. I think a nice chunk of them were brought actually and donated to Reforest London yesterday,
Oh,
the
cool.
tree cycle program.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you for that background. I have a question for you, Maddy. Kind of following up to Cathy's presentation. I'm wondering, what are some of the ways that we measure the health of the urban forest in London today?
That's a great question. There are a lot of ways that we measure the health of the urban forest. So, um, recently, our team, our small but mighty team, growing team now of in the urban forestry department, have been undertaking a large project where we're installing permanent sample plots in all of the city woodlands. So there's about 300 of them. We've gotten to, I think, about 85. I think our goal was 100 this season, but we got started a bit later. So through those permanent sample plots, we're really hoping to gather a lot more information so that we can measure the health of the urban forest more effectively, not just talking about boulevard trees and privately owned trees, but actual urban woodlands. It really ties in with what Cathy's speaking on, as far as especially forests along waterways and in the watershed. So in those plots, we're measuring a lot of different things, taking soil samples, recording invasive species presence, recording tree species presence, size and condition, the amount of down woody debris at a site, the decay class of that woody debris, any wildlife presence, ground cover, vegetation, like you name it, we're recording. So it's a really good starting point for us to be able to then actually have some sort of metrics to measure the health of these areas. So that's a big one right now as far as our urban woodlands that we're spearheading. And we haven't had the opportunity to do in the past, but now it's going to be really, really valuable information for us. A second way we're doing it is through the corporate asset management surveys. So there's several different criteria that this assessment is based on, but specifically we're counting the number of species within a woodland. That's sort of a metric of how healthy it is. Obviously, species diversity is very important in healthy woodlands. And as well, then surveying, like my work, surveying for invasive pests and disease as well. So there's sort of a bunch of different things we're doing to pull together a comprehensive picture of the health of our urban forest within our woodlands. Forestry operations they manage boulevard trees, and we do consult with them on a regular basis on best practices. If we have diseases and pests, making sure we're all on the same page about how to approach management and properly, prevent and mitigate the effects of those things. So yeah, there are a lot of different ways we're measuring the health of our urban forest. And then of course the watershed report cards is another view of everything. So yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that really appreciate that complex answer. There's a lot of nuance to this topic, a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
Would you say that like the goals and kind of recommended actions outlined in the watershed report cards are fairly consistent with the city's goals and recommended actions in terms of how we can take better care of our urban forests?
Of course. I mean, I'm kind of looking at the sort of the summary here. So conserving woodlands through conservation bylaws, connecting isolated woodlands by planting, shelter belts, windbreaks, buffers, increasing natural vegetation cover, improving tree planting. Like all of those things are things that are priorities for the city as well. It's not that we don't want, not that we can't do those things. It just takes a long time to make them happen. And unfortunately, too, in a lot of cases in our urban woodlands, we have to do a significant amount of invasive removal prior to any planting that we're undertaking. And so that's a big roadblock as well for our planting projects and woodland management in general, is how are we going to manage these invasives and then have a plan to ensure that they don't return and that we're planting and we're managing areas quickly enough so that once the removal happens, then you don't get encroachment and you don't get increased foot traffic in those areas. Because as soon as you open up an area in a forest, people find their way in, and then you get compacted soils, vandalism, a lot of issues that come along with that. So it's all about timing, and that removal piece is really big for us right now, is kind of ensuring that we're doing that prior to doing a lot of planting.
Yeah, that's good advice. For the average gardener, I'd say too. I've had to remove a lot of invasive ground cover from my property, like periwinkle, and how I prevented it from coming back was immediately putting in some fairly aggressive native plants that could outcompete it. Like Canada anemone is a great choice, or Canadian ginger in the right conditions. Yeah. Um, I have a question for Cathy or Maddy. And this maybe touches on some things that you've already discussed. It seems like with all of the complexity of managing the urban forest and our scores ranging from C to D to F across the watershed, it's maybe a lot of doom and gloom for some people to read about, right? Like we've got big challenges ahead of us. Um, would you say that there's aspects of London's urban forest that are actually doing fairly well? Are there things that we've succeeded with in the past due to management interventions or things that might be responding to environmental change in ways that are actually favorable?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think all across the watershed, we're seeing, like I say, we've got gains in some parts of the watershed where we're actually seeing some new forest cover being added to our roster because of past planting events. So I think those are really encouraging. And it's not every site needs to have been tree planted. Some of it's just a case of letting a meadow go do its thing, let it succeed into a thicket and into a woodland and let that happen. So I think those are some positive things. And as Maddy was saying, not all green space is of high quality, but at least if you're providing some green space, you've got the opportunity then to go back in and improve it. If you don't have any green space at all, well, then there's no opportunity to even make it better. So I see that as a being a positive. And the fact that, we know that our river corridors are so important and are pretty well vegetated. And we know storms are getting worse. So we've got to keep development out of the floodplain. So those are areas that have great potential for enhancing even further, because you simply can't put development, can't put people's lives at risk by developing close to the river. So I say, yeah, so those are some positive things. And I think just general awareness, a lot of people even know what a native tree is today, whereas maybe 30 years ago, they didn't know what a native tree was. And why would I bother picking that sugar maple over my Norway maple, for example? So I think that's a good sign that people are wanting native trees and they're kind of open to doing that. And yeah.
Yeah, I for sure echo what Cathy was saying about the native trees. There's a big community of folks in London that really are interested in native plant gardening and planting native trees. And thankfully, our knowledge of the species that were planted in the past quite widely in landscapes that now have become invasive, we're slowing down, obviously, planting of those invasive things, and hopefully the industry will catch up as well and just stop selling them altogether. But that's a whole other thing. Something else that's going really well is we're actually seeing a really good growth in our canopy overall. So in 2018, we were sitting at around 26.5% canopy cover. And as of this year, we're looking at 27.8, almost 28% canopy cover. And our target, interim target for the City of London's urban forest strategy is 28% by 2035. So we're actually doing quite well as far as that target goes. So that's something that's quite encouraging. And I think a lot of people in London should be aware of that and proud of it. It could have, something to do with the fact, as Cathy was mentioning, those plantings that had been done previously in the watershed. I'm not sure exactly how many are within the City of London urban growth boundary specifically. That could be a factor that's contributing, as well as just, as we were talking about earlier before we started this discussion, the longer growing season that trees are experiencing nowadays due to climate change, which is unfortunate, but they're actually having a longer period of time to put on biomass and grow the canopies. So whatever it's from, it's a positive thing for sure. So climate change isn't all bad maybe, and possibly we'll see a continued response to that increased temperatures, longer growing season in the coming years.
Yeah, interesting. I want to. Sorry, will you add something?
Yeah, I just said climate change, and I thought, yeah, that it's true. We do have these longer growing seasons. At the same time, we have these more severe windstorms and other storms that are taking down our trees. We had that swath go through that. What's the name of that storm that came through a couple it's got like an Italian sounding.
Jericho.
Yes, yeah. So we just hope that doesn't keep repeating itself, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Interesting. I want to circle back to something that Cathy referenced in her presentation about the importance of interior forest being kind of evaluated as a separate, well, it's part of forest, but it's its own metric. Something I've wondered about is a lot of our woodlots have a fair bit of invasive species. Unfortunately, we've got a lot of buckthorn and that sort of thing. That often exists along kind of the boundary of a woodlot because that's where there might be more encroachment from people's backyards. Maybe there's more birds there. I'm not sure. Does that invasive vegetation have any like functional value to the health of the woodlot? Or is it just sort of like it should all be removed? I've heard different opinions about this, and I've wondered if you guys have an opinion about whether there might actually be some benefit for interior forest by having the presence of a mixture of native and non-native species.
I'll just start off quickly just to clarify. So forest interior is really about size of a woodlot, not
Hmm.
necessarily the composition of it. So, you know, the fatter, the more round or more square a woodlot is, they find it's better because birds, you know, especially who require the safety zones inside a middle of a forest can find protection there because a lot of hawks and so on are, you know, hanging around the edge, the raccoons that eat their eggs and all that kind of thing. So
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, in some cases you might think that like buckthorn encircles a woodlot because it's got the light at the edge and it kind of creates a mantle and kind of closes it in. But we have a lot of native shrubs that would have done the same thing. So dogwoods or what have you, sassafras even. So I don't find that there's a benefit to having invasive species because our native species would have filled all those niches in the past.
Hmm. Makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, I'll agree with Cathy there. And, you know, oftentimes the buckthorn, if you're talking about European buckthorn, it does tend to favor those edge uh, areas. And yeah, there would definitely be other species like the dogwoods and rubus, like raspberries, blackberries, a lot of different things that would provide a similar function to, you know, providing shelter to the interior of the woodlot. But the invasives aren't just on the edges. Like it's not just European buckthorn. So glossy buckthorn actually does quite well in the interior of woodlots. I'm not sure if it's because the European buckthorn just outcompetes it in those edge habitats. It's quite possible. You've got honeysuckle, invasive
Hmm.
honeysuckles, privet, a number of other invasive shrubs that are outcompeting not only understory shrubs and plants in the forest, but also natural regeneration of those canopy species. So, of course, you know, like with anything, you can't just go in and remove everything all at once and expect the ecosystem to return to a natural state. You know, there really has to be a careful approach taken to ensure that the removal that you're doing will not be completely for naught, you know, if you just leave it to be. So that management is very needs to be very strategic for sure. But yeah, the invasives they can go. They cannot be here. That would be
Yeah,
I would agree with that.
yeah.
yeah. No, I think, you know, 60 years ago, if you were a restoration biologist or something, it would have been pretty easy. You know, really, you just let a field do its thing. And now you can't just let a field do its thing because you know everything that is going to come in is going to be invasive. So that's why tree planting projects are important because at least you can insert the native
Hmm.
species and give them a fighting chance of establishing there versus our landscape is just so full of invasives now, and you know it's everywhere in the world, right? We're a cosmopolitan, shipping back and forth, and these aren't mean plants. They're just doing their thing, right? They're colonizing
Yep.
new ground, so
You're in the wrong place.
they're
That's all.
wrong place, like a lot of us are, but really, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I have a beautiful Norway maple in my backyard. And now that I understand its history and what it does to the landscape, I look at it in a new light, but it also shades my home. It's habitat for critters, and so I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with it. I just make sure it doesn't spread too much.
Yeah, and that's a very important feature, as Maddy was saying. You can't just knock down all the invasive trees. I mean,
Mhm.
that would lose so much shade overnight, right? So I think it's a stepwise thing where you just stop planting those really bad ones. Like some of them are not native, but they don't spread, so that's okay. But yeah, as that Norway maple dies, then you have lots of time to think about what good tree can I put in its place later on. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'm already planning.
Yeah.
Um, That's maybe a good segue into another question I wanted to ask. So, our urban forest in London spans across private and public land. So, private land being like my backyard or land owned by a campus, and public land being land that's owned primarily by the City of London. What are some differences in, I guess, approaches taken to plant and care for trees on private versus public land? And in your experience, is one type of land easier to work with than the other?
That's a great question. I guess I can start off. Um, from the perspective of the City of London, we're in a pretty unique position in the fact that we are landowners, but also public servants. So you have a really fine balance between what the citizen or the customer ultimately wants to see happen on the landscape and what might need to happen from an ecological standpoint as well. So it really, the two sort of tug at each other quite often, and something that we find very frequently, and it's definitely a mentality and a generational thing. I find that there's a different approach to and a different expectation on what people want from the landscape. Private citizens generally want something that's aesthetically pleasing, safe, you know, something that they can look at and be pleased by, that's neat and tidy. Whereas, from a standpoint of like a natural forest, you have things that are sort of messy looking. You've got dead trees, you've got scrubby, shrubs, but everything sort of plays an important role in the landscape. So that's really where the balance comes in, is ensuring that the public and the citizens of London are happy with the landscape, but also that the landscape is providing the services that it needs to, for the watershed, for the citizens to benefit from as well. So, and in addition to that, you have home ownership, which changes quite frequently. So you have varying, needs from a single property over the course of its lifespan. So, over 70 years, a property may have, you know, 5 to 10 different owners, varying levels of maintenance done on the trees on the property. Money plays a big role into it as well. It's expensive to maintain the large trees. So I would say it's not necessarily easier in one side or the other, but certainly you deal with those varying expectations from both sides, which can be sort of a challenge.
Hmm.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And even though, yeah, people are, they're all for nature, but maybe not necessarily around their house, so you have to try to blend that. And I mean, if it's public land, generally you have a bit more say in, what can be planted versus on private land, they could just go to the nursery and get what they desire. So yeah, it's an education thing, and it's also what you can afford. And I know
Mhm.
tree, planting a tree is pretty inexpensive compared to taking down a tree next to your house, of course. So yeah.
Yeah. Maddy, were
Yeah.
you going to add something?
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to add too about, so part of my role at the moment is administering the tree canopy conservation program, which is sort of a response to that cost of maintaining trees, because it can be it can be impossible for some people to pay for the maintenance of a large tree, especially as I was saying, somebody owned the property for say 30 years prior, had never had the tree pruned before, and then new people move in and they're having to deal with all of these issues that this tree may have. in some cases, cost wise, it can almost be cheaper to remove it than to maintain it. And so, what we're trying to do with our tree canopy conservation program is to provide incentive to maintain versus remove those distinctive large diameter trees, in hopes of like retaining those veteran trees in the landscape. And it's been really well received so far. So we're still in a pilot stage, but hopefully we can continue to offer that program every year, because it's really helpful for people to be able to access even just a portion of what they would pay to have a tree maintained. And it's not on them, it's nobody's fault, it is expensive to have done. So yeah.
That sounds like a really cool program. I'll have to look it up afterwards. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
I've thought about this sort of intersection between public and private land, especially in the context of street trees in front of people's homes and the sharing of responsibility between municipality and homeowners for things like watering the tree, or removing the little guard around the base of a sapling that eventually will be outgrown by the tree. And people sometimes not really understanding, is this my tree? Is this the city tree? Yeah, it's really a complicated balancing act. And managing expectations and education, like you said, I think is really pivotal there. Um, I come across this phrase sometimes in reading about trees. People will say the right tree in the right place. And I was wondering if that resonates with you at all. What does that phrase mean to each of you?
I'll let Maddy take this. She's more of the individual tree planter.
Yeah, so it's pretty straightforward. It really just means selecting species based on the site characteristics and the characteristics of that tree and trying to match them as well as possible. So you want to consider, a given site based on the water, the soils, the light, the aesthetic needs, any size constraints. You want to set the tree up for the best chance of success possible at the early stage, right? A really great example is you see a lot of, you know, Norway maples is just something that comes to mind, planted directly below utility lines. And then you get that scooped out middle
Mhm.
of the tree, which is what we like to try to avoid if possible, as much as we can. So sometimes it can be challenging to plant the right thing, but that's really what it means, is just making sure that the tree will be successful in that location without intervention as much as possible.
Yeah, and I'll add that the Upper Thames has a list of recommended plants on our website. So we have a list of recommended trees and shrubs, and it actually described, what kind of soil or light conditions it likes. So if people want to kind of do some homework, they can check out these lists and see, how big is it going to get, and does it like well drained, or is it okay with wet soils? So we're lucky to live in the Carolinian zone, where we've got a large number of native species to choose from. Where if you go up in the boreal, you've got a shorter list. So we've got a lot of opportunity to pick a small, pick a large tree, and like I say, don't get in the way of overhead wires or a sidewalk, or will the roots lift up something? So yeah, doing that homework ahead of time will, the tree is going to live hopefully 80, 100 years. In the city, usually less, but so it's worthwhile to do the homework first.
Yeah, I would echo that. And those tree lists are really, really instructive and helpful. I've made a couple mistakes with planting trees myself. Um, and I was consoled by Sarah Rowland, who works for Urban Forestry. She said, Brennan, trees don't last forever. We have this romantic idea that every tree we plant is going to last until the end of time. And that's not always the case. I've had to remove some trees that I put in, and not realizing, a willow in a rain garden by a home is probably not a great idea. Because their root systems are super aggressive and they'll go looking for underground water mains. I've seen trees planted like right beside a house, like cedar trees, and then next thing you know, it's touching the soffit of your roof. So anticipating what the tree is going to look like at maturity, I think, is really, really valuable information when deciding what to plant for your site.
Absolutely.
Um, I want to go back to something that was referenced in our conversation about what is present in a kind of publicly managed natural forest. Um, and specifically, I want to think about dead trees. I'm a bird biologist by training, and I'm aware of some kinds of birds, like the chimney swift, that used to rely on the presence of dead trees on the landscape. We don't see as many dead trees around in London anymore, and this has implications for other species. Um, can you maybe comment on what roles dead trees play on the landscape? And do you think we're doing enough to preserve them in our watershed or in London?
Cathy,
I'll let
you
Maddy
go
start.
ahead. Oh, okay, sure. um, yeah, so yeah, dead trees are very important on the landscape. Um, Brendan, you mentioned birds, so a lot of species rely on dead trees for habitat, for food, um, shelter. As they decay, they contribute to the carbon cycle and improve the soil in the areas and build up the soils. You get all kinds of fungi that then, you know, emerge from the tree and help break down those natural materials and the carbon in the tree. Even if a tree doesn't stay standing while it's decaying, if they fall, they create really unique topography in the landscape. It's called pit and mound. That's very important as well. Um, so 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 dead trees are almost as important, if not more important, than living trees in the landscape, in my opinion. And it's really important to do our best to retain them when we can. Of course, in urban areas, it's not always feasible, especially if you're looking at boulevards, high traffic areas, where obviously you run into issues if there's a dead tree. You know, people are uneasy with it as well. But in those natural forests and in the urban woodlands, through the work we've been doing this season, there are quite a few dead trees still on the landscape. Um, a lot of ash trees were preemptively cut down, so they weren't left standing necessarily in all of our woodlands. So, there is a large amount of that large diameter downed woody debris in the landscape right now, which is sort of a unique feature. It's not always the case in a natural landscape that hasn't had that large scale disturbance. Um, but from a perspective of the city and our approach to managing those dead trees has sort of evolved. So in the past, there was a lot of like preemptive removal that was done, especially along trails of those dead trees, to then prevent a perceived hazard to people who are using those areas. However, now the city's approach is more passive, in that the city responds to um, like public request or feedback. So if someone says, there's a dead tree that's whatever fallen or leaning really hard over the trail or something, then they'll respond. But we're not going out and actively looking for those dead trees to remove. So that approach did lead to sort of a lack of wildlife trees, especially along trails. However, now the approach has changed. So we're looking at retaining more of those. And in our sample plots, we're actually inventorying any snags that are on the landscape. So a snag being a dead standing tree. We're measuring, recording the diameter, the decay class, and actually tagging them as well. So they're part of our inventory moving forward. So we'll go back and monitor those as they continue to decay on the landscape.
Very cool.
Yeah.
No, that's great. And I echo that I know in the environmentally significant areas, early on in the management, everybody, anything that was dead or soon to be dead was taken down. And now it's much more risk-based, like a lot of annual inspections, just take down the ones that could possibly cross, the path of the trail, and not anything that's so far back it would never harm a structure or a trail or anything like that. So I think it took people a while to get comfortable with the fact that this is what forests look like, and there's a little risk in anything you do or anywhere you go. So yeah, the risk of never seeing a woodpecker in your forest because every standing tree has been brought down. Yeah, and also, yeah, just keeping, I mean, some people don't like the look of down, bucked up trees on the ground, but really if you remove all that stuff, you're just taking nutrients away from the forest. So Professor Stan Caveney, he had a great line once that said, you know, a tree is never more alive as when it's dead. So, you know, it goes to show that, you know, it all provides a function in the ecosystem.
Yeah, I concur. I've added a nurse log in my backyard, and I find that that is one of the most biodiverse areas of the property now. There's all kinds of different fungi growing and mosses and things, and the birds know exactly where to go looking for grubs. So I appreciate the comments about the importance of dead trees. Um, I guess to wrap up, I had a general question for each of you. For the average Londoner, a student like myself, or a homeowner, or anyone really, what are some things that they can do on an individual basis to contribute to healthier forests and watershed overall? Of course, many of those actions are outlined in the watershed report cards, but is there one or two take-home messages that you want to iterate?
Yeah, I think it just in some general sense. I mean, you know, not everybody, like you say, has a property that they can, you know, plant on and nurture a garden with it. And obviously, those who do, it's wonderful if you could, you know, continue to grow native plants and provide that continuous shade cover in the city with as little pesticide, you know, use as possible. Sometimes it's needed, but you know, if you're not a homeowner, you know, and you're just a trail user, stay on the trails, you know, like stop, don't make all these trails just because it's 2 seconds quicker to go somewhere else, or you just want to have a see of the river right now, as opposed to wait to the side trail where the river is. So I would say stay on the trails, you know, clean your boots before you go out so you don't spread invasive species. And also support, you know, counselors that support environmental projects. You know, a lot of this stuff is out of our hands, right? In a growing city, an urbanizing city, decisions are made, and how the council feels about conservation matters a lot. So I would say that would be a good, it's a starting point.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll echo what Cathy said about, you know, planting more native species. I think an important point is as well, you don't have to have 100% of your garden be native plants. Like it's not all or nothing here. It's not like rip out everything and plant all native. Like if you like roses, that's great. Have some roses. If you like hydrangeas, no problem. You know, that's okay. It's okay to have a garden because you like the way it looks, but where you can plant native, you know, and there are so many native species that are beautiful as well as functional in the landscape. And so just learn what's out there, what's available, and just try to choose native more, you know, and the more we ask the supplier and the growers for these things, the more they'll become available, right? A lot of it is driven by what the consumer is purchasing. And so that's a big one. That's kind of where a wave, you know, it's getting there. We're getting there, but it's a great way to contribute to improving the landscape for sure in those neighborhoods. In addition, if you are living in an area adjacent to a woodland or a park, please don't dump anything in those parks or woodlands. We see way too often, you know, yard waste, clippings, grass clippings, you know, trimmings from shrubs and things piled at the edge of woodlands. And it may be out of good intention that people are doing these things, or they think, you know, it's natural, it'll decompose, but it does create a lot of issues. It actually will prevent other things from growing because it's so heavy and dense and it won't break down very quickly. So please avoid dumping anything, you know, garbage, anything like that in a natural area, even if it is convenient. There is yard waste collection in various locations. You can drop off yard waste or compost it on your own property. It's a big one. And then another way is just keep an eye out for ways to assist in, you know, invasive species removals, planting events, things like that in the city. If you're really looking to feel involved and get your hands dirty and see a really big impact at the end of the day. The City of London is hoping to start to be offering more buckthorn busting events, so pulling buckthorn in those woodlands and natural areas as well. So just look for ways to lend a hand, and you know you'll feel really rewarded and satisfied at the end of the project. So that was just my 2 cents and what I'd like to add there.
Those are great tips. Thank you both. I would just add to each of your comments that there's a really nice, thriving community of people in London who care deeply about our trees and our forests, gardening with native plants. Many of the plants that I grow that are native species, actually, I did not have to buy from a store. They came from seeds that were shared with me by a neighbor who maybe had extra from their backyard. It's really restorative and connective. I think to have people come together around taking better care of our local environment here, including both of you. Thank you guys so much for sharing your expertise with us. Lots of really good pieces of information there that I hope will be actionable for people. And I would refer folks back to the Watershed Report Cards that Cathy referenced if you care to learn more. The City of London also has really great information about trees and forests on their website. All right, that brings us to the end of our time together. Thank you both again for being here. I always learn a lot talking with folks from the UTRCA and the city, and keep up the great work.
Thanks so much, Brendan.
Thanks very much. It was